Hello, welcome to Economics 231 Extra Credit Macro Video Exam, covering chapters 20, 21, and 26, worth up to a full 10% on your final grade. That's one full letter grade. We'll go over the instructions. You must watch the entire video. You cannot skip through the video, and you must make sure, so no fast forwarding, and you must make sure that the video stops at the end. Sometimes there's a little space where there's video after the final set of questions. You gotta let that run out, or it will not give you credit for taking this exam. And it covers chapters 20, 21, 26. You will not need anything but to pay attention to this video. All questions will come straight from the video. The first thing we're going to talk about here is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand is a curve that shows the level of real GDP purchased by consumers, businesses, and government. Businesses, government, and foreigners, what we called net exports earlier, at different possible price levels during a time period, ceteris paribus. So what we do here is we hold all the other things that would affect how much of a nation's output these four groups would buy, and we only allow the price level to change. And we see how much output, real GDP, these individuals would buy during a given time period. Okay, and once again, this is not a real curve. We don't estimate it. We don't have one. We just use it as a pedagogical tool for mainstream macroeconomics. Now, when we graph this thing on the vertical or the y-axis, we have the average price of goods and services in the economy, and in this case they're using the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, from chapter 17, I believe. The horizontal axis, that's the x-axis, measures the value of final user goods and services included in real GDP measured in base year dollars. So if you'll remember, GDP, real GDP, we take nominal GDP and we divide it by the GDP chain price index, and that gives us real GDP, and that is an attempt to measure real output in the economy. Okay, now think about it. If you decrease the price level, will governments, foreigners, consumers, and businesses buy more or less output? And of course, the answer is they would increase their demand for real GDP, or the quantity that they demand. So they would want to buy more of our GDP, or real GDP, at lower price levels and less at higher price levels. So this is where we get the downward slope to this aggregate demand curve here. Okay, here we have price levels as measured by the CPI, and here we have real GDP in trillions of dollars per year. That's on the x-axis, or the horizontal. Price levels are always on the y. At higher price levels, businesses, consumers, governments, and foreigners would buy less output than they would at lower price levels. So the aggregate demand curve, just like the demand curve from chapter 3, is downward sloping and to the right. Now, this aggregate demand curve, downward sloping to the right aggregate demand curve, can shift. If any of the components of GDP, consumption, and that's a C there, the slide is a little off. Investment, I, that's businesses buying final user goods and services. Government spending, government buying final user goods and services. Or net exports, exports minus import spending, Any of these can change, and that will shift the aggregate demand curve. So if we get an increase in C, I, G, or net exports, that will cause an increase in the aggregate demand curve. And as we'll see in the next slide, we're going to shift it to the right for an increase. If, on the other hand, C, I, G, or net exports decrease, say animal spirits decrease, that would cause a drop in investment spending. That would cause aggregate demand curve to decrease. And we'll shift it to the left. So here, this is an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, maybe interest rates are lower, and this is causing businessmen to increase their investment spending. That's I. So C plus I plus G plus NX equals aggregate demand. So now, at any given price level, consumers, businesses, governments, and foreigners will buy more real GDP from this economy at a given price level than they would before. So you can see here the price level stays at 200. Here on the original aggregate demand curve, AD1, consumers, businesses, governments, and foreigners would buy $12 trillion worth of real GDP from this economy. Then we get a decrease in interest rates, which causes this aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Now at that same 200 price level, more real output will be bought, 16 trillion. Okay, so that's an increase in aggregate demand. If we shifted the curve to the left, that would be a decrease in aggregate demand. At this point, we're going to have a few quiz questions. After you're done answering the questions, the video will resume and we'll move forward. Welcome back. The next thing we're going to look at is something called the aggregate supply. In economics, you always have some kind of demand and some kind of supply. Here we have aggregate demand, and we're also going to have an aggregate supply curve. What is aggregate supply? It is a curve that shows the level of real GDP produced at different price levels during a time period, ceteris paribus. So here we hold all the other things constant that would cause you to produce output in the economy, and we allow price levels to change, and we see how much producers would offer on the market in terms of final user goods and services at different price levels. Okay. There are a number of different opposing theories. We're going to review 2 or 3 of them here on the shape of this aggregate demand curve. And this is based on what type of assumptions the economists who are drawing this use. Now, one big problem with making assumptions is it makes a you-know-what out of you and me. But aside from that, are these assumptions realistic? Many of the economists who make them would say that they don't have to be. What's important is, do the models that result from our assumptions make good predictions about the economy? So we've got the Keynesian view and the classical view. Okay. Now here, John Maynard Keynes assumed that prices and wages were inflexible in the downward position. This results in a backward L-shaped aggregate supply curve. So we could imagine here's aggregate demand, and it intersects right here at the corner. Okay. And that produces a price level of 100. And in this case, the economy is operating at full employment. Now, let's say that aggregate demand decreases. So that curve shifts. Oops, I'm sorry. Shifts to the left here. It would now intersect this new curve, or excuse me, the aggregate supply curve, at some new output, which would be less than full employment. And that would result in a recession. Now, Keynes assumed that prices and wages were inflexible in the downward direction, So prices can go up, but they can't go down. They can't go below this 100 price level. Okay, I call it the Weeble Wobbles assumption. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. Well, here, prices can go up, but they can't go down. So they can't go below 100, but they can go above it. So as we shift this curve to the left, if you look over here, that would cause prices to stay the same because Keynes assumed it. You could assume that they don't and get a different answer, but he assumed that they didn't. They were inflexible in a downward direction. They could go up, but they couldn't go down, so they can't go down when demand decreases. So the price level stays the same, but that would have to cause a decrease in output. Why? Okay. Spending is equal to the prices we pay times the amount of output we buy. If prices can't go down, output has to go down when spending decreases. And that would move us from here to some point B right here that I'll draw on the next graph. So here's that same graph. And I'm going to draw an initial aggregate demand curve. Okay. So this is going to be my aggregate demand curve, AD1, we call it. Now, say animal spirits decrease in the economy, and that causes a reduction in output. So here's aggregate demand is equal. Sorry, I want to do that in black. I'm going to escape, redo that. Okay, here we go. Aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, and X is equal to exports minus imports spending. So here, we're going to cause I to go down, okay? And I'm going to draw a little downward arrow here. Okay, so investment spending decreases. That's going to cause aggregate demand to fall. So this aggregate demand curve is going to decrease here to AD2. And output is going to fall here. What did it do? Okay. To point B. And if we trace point B down here, output is at some new lower level. Here's full employment. So this economy will go into a recession. Now, Keynes thought that the only thing that could get you out of this recession would be an increase in spending. That somehow we've got to increase C, I, G, or NX in order to get the economy out of this recession. Well, how do we do that, right? So here, I'll put it down here. I'm going to put the plus signs in there this time. Aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. So we need to boost aggregate demand from AD2 back to AD1. How do we do it? Well, one thing we could do is we could increase G, the government could come in and increase spending. There's a number of ways that Keynes would recommend doing this. You could pay public works projects. You could build more schools. You could build dams on rivers. You could pay people not to work. Okay, doesn't matter. You could pay unemployment compensation, welfare payments, we commonly call welfare, Social Security. These were all New Deal programs. Some people might say inspired by Keynes, or you could have a war. Anything to increase aggregate demand. So if we increase G, that would boost aggregate demand, spend enough money theoretically, and the government could spend us out of the recession. You could also, cut taxes. And that would increase consumption spending. So here we cut income taxes. People have more money in their pockets. They're going to spend some proportion of that on buying goods and services. And Keynes said that would increase C, boosting aggregate demand and pushing it to the right. Okay. So those are a couple of expansionary policies we could use to get the economy out of this recession and boost us back here to full employment. Now, we're going to go over this in more detail later, but there are also monetary policies you could use. These are fiscal. Okay, but we're going to go over fiscal policies later. You could also increase the money supply. That would cause interest rates to decrease, and that might cause investment spending to go up. Okay, and maybe consumer spending as consumers get lower payments on their credit cards. The house payments go down. They can afford to buy bigger houses, etc. So they also might spend more money. All right. But that's a quick overview of the original, what I call OG Keynes. Okay, and that's based off of this backward L-shaped aggregate supply curve. And that shape comes from his assumption that prices and wages were inflexible in the downward direction. Okay, that gives us the shape of this aggregate supply curve. We will now have a short set of questions and come back. Welcome back. The next thing we're going to look at is another group of assumptions and how it relates to the shape of the aggregate supply curve and how we should interact or operate in the economy and what causes business cycles. So here, the classical economists, according to Keynes, and this was really a straw man that he built. Nobody really believed this. Nobody even had drawn aggregate supply curves at this point. But it is a vertical line at the full employment real GDP. It's just a straight up and down line. And the reason it's vertical is because the classical economists believe that the economy normally operated at full employment real GDP because markets will adjust in a short period of time without government intervention. So we don't need the government, according to this Keynesian classical economist straw man, to come in and smooth out the excesses of a business cycle. The market will do it for us. Okay, unlike Keynes, classical economists believed that prices and wages were flexible, that they could go up and they could go down. A decrease in aggregate demand curve creates a surplus of unsold goods, but firms can simply cut prices and lay off workers. Competition from unemployed workers reduces the wage rate, and as prices fall, consumers increase their spending downward along the aggregate demand curve, according to what's called the real balances effect. Okay. So aggregate demand decreases and the economy's at full employment. That causes unemployment because of a decrease in prices. This unemployment causes the economy to move to a level of full employment because these unemployed workers want to get back in the workforce and they will negotiate lower wages. So wages will drop along with demand, and in the end, the economy will return to full output, and this should not take very long. So here is this vertical aggregate supply curve at full employment. You can see here the economy is operating at E1. Then we get a drop in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. At this price level, fewer goods and services are bought by consumers, businesses, governments, and foreigners. And that causes unemployment. And these workers re-entering the workforce, negotiating wages down, cause prices to fall, and that returns the economy to full employment output. These two dots are off for some reason. I don't know how to fix it. Okay, bring us back to full employment. Now, we're going to have a short quiz, some short test questions, and then come back. Okay, welcome back. The next thing we're going to look at is a third sort of set of assumptions about the aggregate supply curve, and that is a upward sloping section in what they call the intermediate range. You'll see later that we're going to use the book uses the Keynesian range, that horizontal section, and then they have an intermediate range where the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, and then that ends in the classical range, and we'll talk about that later. But why would the aggregate supply curve upward slope? Your book talks about different reasons why. One are bottlenecks, obstacles to output flows develop because firms cannot fill orders and raise their prices. Two, labor shortages make wage increase demands difficult to reject. So here we might say that wages are sticky. And production cost rises. Firms use less skilled labor and machinery to fill orders. So here, production costs might rise, and that would prevent us from either having a horizontal or vertical supply curve. Okay, here are the three ranges of the aggregate supply curve. There's the Keynesian range, you can see here. Okay, then next we have the intermediate range, and this should meet up here. I don't know why it doesn't. And then we have this vertical section here, and that is called the classical range. And this is just a made-up aggregate supply curve that the books use to sort of explain different assumptions regarding cost. Keynes, as we said before, didn't have this intermediate range. He just had a horizontal section that ended at full employment, a backward L. The classicals straight up and down. It's just a creation. Okay, so over the Keynesian range, as demand increases, aggregate demand increases and pushes us along this aggregate supply curve, you can see here that output increases, but prices don't change. If we went backwards, say we decreased aggregate demand on this portion of the curve, that would cause price levels to stay the same, but output to go up. So over the Keynesian range, changes in output only cause changes in output. Prices stay the same because Keynes thought that they were inflexible in the downward direction. Over this intermediate range here, you can see that an increase in aggregate demand would cause output to increase and prices to go up. So on this intermediate range, changes in changes in aggregate demand cause changes in output and prices at the same time. So if aggregate demand is increasing, pushing us up this intermediate range, and remember this thing didn't line up here for some reason, okay, that would cause output to increase and prices to go up. You can see as I move to the right. If aggregate demand decreased on this this intermediate range, that would cause prices to fall and output to decrease. And then finally, we have this classical range here. Once you get to full employment, you can't do any better than that, or at least not in the long run. So changes in aggregate demand only cause price levels to go up or down on this classical range. So in the classical range, changes in aggregate demand only changes in price. On the Keynesian range, changes in aggregate demand cause changes in output, no change in price. And on the intermediate, both change. That should help you when looking at these curves later on. And there again is full employment. Now we're going to take a short quiz and come back. Welcome back. Now, here we're going to bring that aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve together and look and see how equilibrium is determined. Equilibrium occurs where aggregate demand curve equals or crosses the aggregate supply curve. Okay, and I'm going to draw that one for you. So we'll go back to my little paint, and here it is right here. I've already drawn it. You can see here where aggregate demand crosses that aggregate supply. That's an equilibrium. Keynes thought that there could be more than one equilibrium. Anytime aggregate demand crosses this curve, that is its own separate equilibrium. The big problem or big change for Keynes was he thought that you could have an equilibrium at less than full employment output. The classical economists said you couldn't. So back to our lecture here. Fiscal policy. Okay. Here you will learn how the federal government uses discretionary fiscal policy to influence the economy's performance. Fiscal policy is the use of government control over spending and taxing policies to affect macroeconomic change. Okay, so here you're going to use government spending and taxing policy to alter that aggregate demand curve if it were real. Now here, let's say the economy's in a recession. Output is less than full employment. We have higher than normal unemployment. What would the government do in this situation? Now, if you adhere to this aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework and make certain assumptions about prices and wages, expansionary fiscal policy can cure a recession by, number one, you can increase government spending, and we talked about that. You can decrease taxes, or you can increase government spending and taxes equally, according to your book. Okay. So if you did this, that would be expansionary fiscal policy. Now, let's say the economy is in a boom, an inflationary boom, and we have high price inflation. There, you would want to contract or decrease aggregate supply. And the way you would do that would be to decrease government spending, increase taxes, or decrease government spending and taxes. Now, you might ask, why do you do these two things? While on the one hand, decreasing government spending will contract aggregate demand, if you increase taxes, that decreases aggregate demand. Why would we want to decrease taxes while we're decreasing government spending to try and decrease aggregate demand? And the reason for that has to do with something called the spending multiplier we'll look at later. But if government cuts their spending, they write in the budget, we're going to cut it by $100 billion. Then in that case, the government doesn't spend $100 billion. When governments cut taxes for people, some of that money gets spent, but not all of it. So let's say we cut taxes by $100 million, $1 billion, okay? That $100 billion is going to go into people's bank accounts. But people don't spend all of their money. They save some too. So in this case, maybe consumers save 20% of their income, so that $100 billion in extra income that consumers get, they'll put 20 billion of that away and only spend 80. So here, if we were to decrease government spending by 100 and cut taxes by 100, people would only spend 80 of it. So we would have a 20% increase in spending, because government spends more, or the government, a 20 billion less in spending than before, because the government cuts by the full 100, and the taxes, only 80% of the spending is cut, or increased, 80 billion of it would be an increase in spending. So here, increasing government spending or decreasing in taxes causes an increase in aggregate demand, and that will increase the price level and real GDP. Okay, if we're on this intermediate range here. Okay, so here we increase government spending or decrease taxes. That increases aggregate demand. The economy goes from being in a recession, where we're only producing $13 trillion worth of stuff, over here to this new aggregate demand curve on the aggregate supply curve, where output is 14 trillion, and that's in this little economy here, full employment. That's the best they can do. Price levels go up from 210 to 215. Output goes up from 13 to 14 trillion dollars in real GDP. Now here, as we increase aggregate demand, prices, if they stay constant at 210, will result in the economy temporarily producing at above full employment. This goes away because as these firms increase this causes a shortage. People are willing to buy more than the economy's producing. That would cause firms to reduce or lower their output. As they lower their output, that would cause a reduction in their inventories, and they would produce more goods and services. But as they do that, prices would go up and wages would go up, and the economy would move up here to point E2, or equilibrium E2. Take a short quiz, come back. Of the aggregate supply curve. Here, if we have price inflation, we can decrease government spending or increase taxes. That would decrease aggregate demand, and that would cause a decrease in the price level and real GDP. You'll hear the TV people talk about, and they say, oh, the economy's overheated. We've got price inflation. Well, in the Keynesian type model, the answer is to cut government spending or increase taxes for fiscal policy. That will decrease this aggregate demand curve and cause a decrease in the price level and real GDP. So here, we're on the classical region. We're operating here at E1, and prices have gone up. Okay, we're at a price level of 220. Now, if we want to reduce prices, we could decrease government spending. That would cause a decrease in aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2. Now, consumers would only be willing and able to purchase, consumers, governments, businesses, and foreigners would only be willing to purchase $13 trillion of our GDP. 14 trillion is supplied at that price. That would create a surplus of output. a surplus of output. To the right side. There we go. A surplus of output. These producers would have output they've produced, but they can't sell it. So to alleviate that, they would drop prices. As prices fall, aggregate demand increases, the quantity demanded increases, and that brings us back down here to E2. In this case, output is still $14 trillion because we're on the classical range, but that price level has come down from 220 to 215. So we can use fiscal policy to combat inflation in the Keynesian model here. Now, that was discretionary policy. We also have, and discretionary means the government can choose not to do it. They have to go to a vote. They say, oh, we're going to increase spending, pass it through Congress, have the president sign it. Okay. Now, there are also built into the system what are called automatic stabilizers. These are federal expenditures and tax revenues that automatically change levels in order to stabilize an economic expansion or contraction. What are examples of these things? Transfer payments, unemployment compensation. When the economy is bad, more people are unemployed. They make more claims for unemployment compensation, and that increases the government spending on them. Welfare, we commonly call welfare, temporary assistance to needy families. People start losing jobs or getting their hours cut. They go from being non-poor to poor. That makes more welfare claims. Unemployment compensation, welfare, there we go. And tax collections. In the sense of tax collections here, it is with the progressive tax system. As you make more money, you pay a higher marginal rate. Well, if the economy gets bad, people are going to fall down in income and they're going to go into lower brackets, and thus they'll pay a lower percentage of their income in taxes, so that would reduce their tax burden. Here you get an increase in real GDP, tax collections rise, and government transfer payments fall. That would tend to cause a budget surplus and offset inflation. A budget surplus is a situation in which government revenues exceed government expenditures in a given period of time. You've never seen this in your life, okay? It was reported in the 90s, but that was just the budget. They didn't include off-budget stuff. The last time the U.S. government even balanced their budget was 1955. Not even I was alive then. So if you get a decrease in real GDP, tax collections fall, and government transfer payments rise, that budget deficit would offset a recession. So it's the opposite of what we just did. Okay, a budget deficit is a situation in which government expenditures exceed revenues. They spend more money than they take in taxes. That's the norm. Okay. So here you can see, here we're at what we call full employment output, and the government's budget were somehow balanced. If the economy overheated, okay, that would cause tax revenues to increase as people went up in their tax brackets and made more money. That would cause government spending theoretically to fall because people who are on welfare or unemployment compensation now have jobs. So that decreases the government spending. Here they're taxing more than they spend. That's a budget deficit. Okay? And that would be contractionary fiscal policy. The other end of things, let's say the economy went down below 14 trillion. As the economy goes down, tax collections decrease because people have lower incomes and people fall from higher brackets to lower brackets. As that's going on, more people are becoming poor and unemployed and drawing transfer payments from the government. So that increases government spending. And here you have a budget deficit where the government is spending more money than they take in taxes. And that's the opposite of a budget surplus where the government's taking in more in taxes than spending. So these would tend to help stabilize the economy. We'll take a short quiz and come back. Welcome back. Supply side fiscal policy. The Keynesian policies that we just discussed only affect demand, okay? They don't affect supply. Now, people have come up with supply side economics or supply side fiscal policy. This is a fiscal policy that emphasizes government policies that increase aggregate supply rather than affecting the demand side. The purpose of supply side fiscal policies is to achieve long-run growth in real output, full employment, and a lower price level. So here, increase in government spending and a decrease in net taxes would increase the aggregate demand curve. That's a Keynesian demand side fiscal policy. And we see how that would work. From the lectures we just completed. Supply side fiscal policy. Here, a decrease in resource prices, technological advances, subsidies, or a decrease in regulation can cause an increase in the aggregate supply curve. So you have to remember these. A decrease in resource prices, technological advance, subsidies, or a decrease in regulation can increase aggregate supply. And here's how that would look. Here's our initial equilibrium. Full employment is out here at 12 trillion. We're in a short run equilibrium where we're producing $8 trillion worth of output, and we have a price level of 150. Now, if we push this aggregate supply curve to the right, watch what happens. The economy moves from E1 to E2. And as that happens, the price level falls, so we get the opposite of price inflation, we get price deflation, and the output increases, and if we increase aggregate supply enough, we can get back to this aggregate demand, this equilibrium here, where we're producing at full employment. So instead of altering the blue curve, the aggregate demand curve, we're going to alter this aggregate supply curve if it was real. So how supply side policies affect labor markets. Okay, here we have that equilibrium, E1 here. And at an equilibrium of E1 before a tax cut, we have labor supply and we have labor demand. Where those two curves cross, that determines the amount of output in the, or labor hired in the economy. And you can see here that's lower than full employment. An unemployment level around 5%. So maybe here it's, we have greater than 5% unemployment. This is the number of workers, not unemployment. So this is how many workers we should have working, but we only have this many working. The difference, those are unemployed. So here, if we were to perform a tax cut, that has the effect of increasing labor supply, because now those wages, any given amount of wages, more of that money goes into your pocket because you pay less in taxes. That will incentivize more workers to work. And that will result in a situation where employment, or the amount of labor we're using, is increased and wage rates have dropped. But that's not such a bad deal, because if you go back here, prices also drop with the wages. Short break.